Bullied teen helps elderly neighbor move, never realizing he's a WW2 hero with a surprise gift. This was the thought that kept repeating in Ethan Walker's mind as he pressed the ice pack against his swollen cheek, wondering how he'd ended up agreeing to help the old man next door when he could barely help himself. The cold numbed his skin, but did little for the humiliation still burning inside him. Another day, another beating. The routine had become so familiar that Ethan sometimes wondered if this was all his life would ever be. A series of hallway ambushes, mocking laughter, and the silent walk home with fresh bruises he'd have to explain away to his mother. At 16, he'd perfected the art of creative excuses. Basketball accidents, clumsiness, doors that seemingly had vendettas against his face. His bedroom felt like the only safe place in the world. Posters of vintage airplanes covered walls painted a fading blue years ago. Model aircraft hung from the ceiling on fishing line, dancing slightly in the breeze from the half-open window. Outside, leaves were beginning to turn, September bringing its particular golden light that made everything look like a memory already forming. Ethan's phone buzzed. Another message from the group chat he wasn't supposed to know about. Screenshots sent by Emma, the only person at school who seemed to notice him as a human being rather than a target. He didn't need to look. It would be more of the same. Tyler and his friends planning tomorrow's torment with the casual cruelty of those who had never known what it felt like to be on the receiving end. Ethan? His mother's voice called from downstairs. Mr. Holcomb is here to talk to you about tomorrow. Sighing, Ethan tossed the ice pack into the small trash bin beside his desk. He examined his reflection in the mirror hanging on his closet door. The bruise was visible, but not as bad as it could have been. Nothing a little creative storytelling couldn't handle. Mr. Holcomb stood in the living room, his thin frame somehow managing to look both fragile and sturdy at once. At 82, Walter Holcomb was the neighborhood fixture everyone knew, but few really talked to. He'd lived in the faded blue house next door for as long as anyone could remember, tending meticulously to his garden and nodding politely when neighbors passed by. There he is, Ethan's mother said with forced cheerfulness. She was working a double shift tomorrow. Another reason Ethan had reluctantly agreed to help their elderly neighbor move some furniture and boxes. I was just telling Mr. Holcomb how excited you are to help. The old man's eyes, surprisingly sharp in his weathered face, didn't miss the discoloration on Ethan's cheek. Something flickered across his expression. Not pity, which Ethan had grown to hate, but something else. Recognition, perhaps. Appreciate the help, son, Mr. Holcomb said, his voice gravelly but strong. Not as spry as I used to be, and there's some heavy lifting needed. It's no problem, Ethan mumbled, studying the worn carpet beneath his feet. 7:30 too early for you? Thought we'd get started before the heat kicks in. Ethan nodded, calculating that if they finished early enough, he might avoid Tyler and his friends altogether. Saturday usually meant they'd be sleeping in, not looking for him until afternoon. He'll be there, his mother promised, shooting Ethan a look that said this was non-negotiable. Since Dad left 3 years ago, she'd been insistent on him building character through good deeds and responsibility, as if helping an old man move boxes might somehow transform him into someone who didn't get shoved into lockers on a daily basis. After Mr. Holcomb left, Ethan's mother approached, gently turning his face to examine the bruise. Basketball again? She asked, her voice carrying that terrible mixture of concern and willful ignorance that parents perfect when they suspect the truth but aren't ready to face it. Yeah, Ethan lied. Got an elbow to the face. She looked like she wanted to say more, but instead sighed and kissed his forehead. I'm proud of you for helping Mr. Holcomb. That man has lived alone for decades, never asked for anything. Do you know anything about him? Ethan asked, suddenly curious. His mother shrugged. Keeps to himself. There was a wife once, I think, but that was before we moved here. Mrs. Caldwell from down the street says he's a veteran, but he never talks about it. That night, Ethan slept fitfully, dreams filled with falling airplanes and boxes too heavy to lift. He woke before his alarm, the first pale light of dawn filtering through his blinds. For a moment, he considered texting Mr. Holcomb with some excuse, but the thought of his mother's disappointment kept him from reaching for his phone. The morning air carried the first hint of autumn crispness as Ethan crossed the small stretch of lawn separating their houses. Mr. Holcomb's garden, unlike most of the neighborhood's manicured displays, grew with a controlled wildness, vegetables and flowers intermingling in patterns that seemed random but somehow intentional. The old man answered on the first knock, already dressed in worn jeans and a faded plaid shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with sinew and old scars. "Right on time, Mr." Holcomb nodded approvingly. "Come on in. Coffee?" "No, thanks," Ethan replied, surprised by the offer. Adults rarely treated him as anything but a child. The inside of Mr. Holcomb's house was like stepping into another era. Furniture that belonged in a museum, photographs in simple frames, bookshelves lined with volumes whose titles Ethan couldn't read from the doorway. No television that he could see. The place smelled of wood polish, old books, and something else. A faint metallic scent Ethan couldn't place. "I'm not moving out," Mr. Holcomb explained, leading Ethan through the living room toward a hallway. "Just rearranging. Getting older means thinking differently about space." He said this matter-of-factly without self-pity. The hallway led to a room that had clearly once been an office or study. Boxes were stacked against one wall, a heavy wooden desk dominated the center, and filing cabinets lined another wall. The room felt both organized and overwhelming. "Need to clear this out," Mr. Holcomb explained, making room for a hospital bed. "Doctor's orders. Got to sleep elevated for my heart. Means turning this room into a bedroom and moving all this to the basement." Ethan nodded, suddenly understanding the scale of the task ahead. This wasn't just moving a few boxes. This was dismantling what looked like a lifetime of work. "We'll start with the books," Mr. Holcomb decided, pointing to several empty boxes on the floor. "Pack those shelves. I've labeled the boxes for where they should go." They worked in companionable silence for nearly an hour, Ethan carefully placing leather-bound volumes and paperbacks into designated boxes. He couldn't help but notice the titles. Books on military history, aviation, philosophy, and poetry. Not what he'd expected from the quiet old man. "Careful with that one, Mr. Holcomb said suddenly as Ethan reached for a thin volume bound in faded blue cloth. "Here's some first edition Yeats. My wife's favorite." Ethan handled the book with new reverence, noting the publication date, 1928. "Your wife liked poetry?" Something softened in the old man's eyes. "Marianne could recite Yeats from memory. Said his words were what got her through the war while I was away." He took the book from Ethan, opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon, and read in a voice suddenly musical with memory. "How many loved your moments of glad grace and loved your beauty with love, false or true? But one man loved the pilgrim soul in you and loved the sorrows of your changing face." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Ethan saw not an elderly neighbor, but a young man in love, holding on to poems while the world burned around him. Mr. Holcomb cleared his throat, carefully placing the book in a box marked bedroom. "Let's take a break. You must be hungry." In the kitchen, sunlight streamed through windows that overlooked the garden. Mr. Holcomb moved with surprising efficiency, producing sandwiches, apple slices, and 2 glasses of lemonade that tasted homemade. As they ate, Ethan found his eyes drawn to a photograph on the refrigerator. A black and white image of young men in military uniforms standing before an aircraft, their faces squinting against bright sunlight. "Is that you?" he asked, gesturing toward the photo. Mr. Holcomb followed his gaze. "Long time ago." He didn't elaborate, and something in his expression discouraged further questions. After lunch, they tackled the desk, emptying drawers into boxes labeled with meticulous handwriting. In one drawer, Ethan found a small wooden box with intricate carvings. "Should I pack this too?" he asked, holding it up. Mr. Holcomb's expression changed subtly. "No, leave that out. That stays with me." Curiosity burned in Ethan, but he set the box aside without comment. By mid-afternoon, they had emptied most of the room. Only the desk and filing cabinets remained. Ethan's muscles ached pleasantly, the physical labor somehow more satisfying than he'd expected. He hadn't checked his phone once, hadn't thought about Tyler or school or the bruise on his face. "That's enough for today," Mr. Holcomb announced. "The movers will handle the furniture tomorrow." "You've been a big help, Ethan." Ethan felt an unexpected surge of disappointment. "I could come back tomorrow after the movers. Help you unpack." The old man studied him for a moment, those keen eyes seeing more than Ethan was comfortable with. "If you like," he finally said. "See, Mike could use the company." Walking home in the golden afternoon light, Ethan realized he'd spent an entire day without fear. The sensation was so unfamiliar, it took him a moment to identify it. His mother was still at work, the house empty and quiet. He showered, the hot water soothing his tired muscles, then warmed up leftover pasta. As he ate, his phone buzzed repeatedly. The Saturday night planning session for Sunday's activities. He turned it face down without reading the messages. That night, he dreamed of flying, of looking down at the world from a great height, everything below reduced to pattern and perspective. Sunday morning greeted him with rain, fat drops pattering against his window. Ethan found himself looking forward to returning to Mr. Holcomb's house. The old man's quiet dignity and the peaceful atmosphere of his home had been unexpectedly comforting. The moving truck was pulling away as Ethan approached, rain dripping from his jacket hood. Mr. Holcomb answered the door with a nod of recognition, as if he'd been certain Ethan would return despite the weather. "They got everything downstairs," he reported. "Now comes the organizing." The former study was transformed. The heavy desk and filing cabinets were gone, replaced by a hospital bed positioned to face the window overlooking the garden. The walls stripped of bookshelves revealed faded wallpaper with a subtle pattern of leaves. "We'll set up my books and photographs down in the basement," Mr. Holcomb explained. "Make a proper study down there." The basement surprised Ethan. Unlike the dark, cluttered space beneath his own house, Mr. Holcomb's basement was clean and well lit, with whitewashed walls and a concrete floor sealed and painted light gray. The movers had positioned the desk beneath a small window, and the filing cabinet stood against one wall. "Your job," Mr. Holcomb instructed, "is to unpack the books according to the labels. I've got a system, history on that shelf, literature there, reference books on the bottom." They worked steadily through the morning, the rain creating a soothing backdrop to their efforts. As Ethan unpacked, he found himself examining the books more closely, occasionally reading passages that caught his eye. "You read a lot?" Mr. Holcomb asked, noticing Ethan's interest in a book about the Battle of Britain. "Sometimes," Ethan admitted, "mostly science fiction and stuff for school." "Nothing wrong with imagination," the old man replied, "but there's something to be said for history too. Real stories, real people, sometimes more incredible than anything made up." As the afternoon progressed, Ethan found himself relaxing in the old man's presence. There was something calming about Mr. Holcomb's methodical approach to the work, his quiet appreciation for objects that had meaning beyond their monetary value. They took another break for lunch, soup that Mr. Holcomb had apparently prepared the previous evening, crusty bread still warm from the oven. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he'd had homemade soup that wasn't from a can. "This is really good," he said between spoonfuls. "My Marianne's recipe," Mr. Holcomb replied. "Sustenance for body and soul," she called it. "How long were you married?" Ethan asked, emboldened by the companionable atmosphere. 52 years, the old man answered, his gaze distant. "Not long enough." After lunch, they returned to the basement to continue unpacking. As Ethan arranged books on a shelf, a small metallic object fell from between two volumes, clattering to the floor. He bent to retrieve it, a metal tarnished with age but still impressive with its ribbon and intricate design. "I found this," he said, holding it out uncertainly. Mr. Holcomb took it, his expression unreadable. "Thought I'd lost this years ago," he said quietly. "Must have been using it as a bookmark." "What is it?" Ethan asked. The old man hesitated, then replied, "Distinguished Flying Cross. Military award. For what you did in the war?" Ethan ventured, remembering his mother's comment about Mr. Holcomb being a veteran. Something changed in the air between them. A door opening, perhaps, or a barrier lowering. "Sit down, Ethan," Mr. Holcomb said, gesturing to a chair. "I don't talk about this much, but maybe it's time someone heard it besides these old walls." Ethan sat, curiosity banishing his usual reticence. "I was a bomber pilot," Mr. Holcomb began, his voice taking on a different quality. Stronger, yet somehow more distant. B-17 Flying Fortress. 25 missions over Europe in 1944 and 45. This, he held up the medal, was for getting my crew home after our plane took heavy damage over Dresden. Ethan's eyes widened. The quiet old man who tended his garden and read poetry had flown bombing missions in World War II. The disconnect between image and reality momentarily stunned him. Were you scared?" he asked. Mr. Holcomb's laugh held no humor. "Terrified. Every single mission. Anyone who says they weren't is either lying or didn't understand what was happening." He turned the medal over in his gnarled fingers. "Fear isn't the problem, Ethan. It's what you do with it that matters." For the next hour, Mr. Holcomb spoke about experiences he'd kept largely to himself for decades. He described the bone-deep cold at high altitude, the thunder of anti-aircraft fire, the way time seemed to stretch and compress during combat. He spoke of friends lost, of narrow escapes, of writing letters to the families of those who didn't make it home. Ethan listened, transfixed. The history books he'd skimmed in school had never conveyed the human reality of war like this. The small details, the moments of terror and courage, the weight of responsibility for other lives. "My crew," Mr. Holcomb said, pulling a photograph from one of the boxes. 10 of us all together. I'm the only one left now." The photograph showed young men in flight jackets standing before a massive airplane. Lady Luck, painted on its nose alongside an image of a winking woman. Ethan could barely reconcile the confident young man at the center, tall, straight-backed, with a half smile, with the elderly neighbor sitting across from him. "That's you?" he asked, pointing. Mr. Holcomb nodded. "Lieutenant Walter Holcomb, age 23. Thought I knew everything." His finger moved across the photo, touching each face. "My crew, my responsibility, my family." The afternoon light had begun to fade, rain still pattering against the small basement window, when Mr. Holcomb finally fell silent. Ethan realized they'd abandoned the unpacking entirely, surrounded by half-emptied boxes and memories. "Thank you for telling me," Ethan said quietly, uncertain what else to say in the face of such history. The old man's gaze was sharp again, present rather than lost in the past. "Not many want to hear old war stories these days." "I did," Ethan assured him. It's amazing what you did." "Nothing amazing about doing what needs doing," Mr. Holcomb replied with a shake of his head. "Now we'd better finish this unpacking before your mother thinks I've kidnapped you." They worked until early evening, completing most of the organization. As Ethan prepared to leave, Mr. Holcomb pressed something into his hand, a book. "Thought you might enjoy this," he said. "About the air war. More accurate than most." Ethan took the book, touched by the gesture. "Thanks. I'll bring it back when I'm done." "Keep it," Mr. Holcomb said. "And if you want to hear more stories or just help an old man in his garden, my door's open." Walking home through the light rain, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years. A connection to someone outside his immediate family, a thread of understanding that transcended the usual barriers of age and circumstance. Monday morning arrived with dreaded familiarity, the knot in his stomach as he approached the school building, the careful survey of hallways for Tyler and his friends, the practiced invisibility that sometimes, but not often enough, helped him avoid their attention. He made it through first period unscathed, second period too. By lunch, he'd begun to hope this might be one of those rare days when they were too busy with other targets to notice him. The hope died as he left the cafeteria. Tyler and 2 of his friends stepped directly into his path, their expressions promising the usual routine. "Walker," Tyler sneered. "Missed you this weekend? Had some special plans." Ethan's eyes darted, seeking escape routes, finding none. The hallway had emptied, most students already in classrooms or outside. No teachers in sight. "Not now, Tyler." He tried, knowing it was futile. "I'm going to be late." "We'll write you a note." Tyler laughed, shoving Ethan against the lockers. The metallic clang echoed down the empty hallway. Excused absence due to being a pathetic loser. The familiar script unfolded. The shove, the taunts, the helpless anger and humiliation. But as Tyler grabbed the front of Ethan's shirt, something unexpected happened in Ethan's mind. He saw not Tyler's sneering face, but the photograph of Mr. Holcomb and his crew. Young men facing dangers these bullies couldn't begin to comprehend. What would that 23-year-old lieutenant think of him now, cowering against lockers? What would the man who had flown through enemy fire to bring his crew home say about this moment? For the first time, Ethan felt something beyond fear and resignation. He felt perspective. "Let go," he said, his voice steadier than he'd expected. Tyler blinked, momentarily surprised by the tone. "What did you say?" "I said let go," Ethan repeated, maintaining eye contact. "This is getting old, don't you think? Same routine day after day. Aren't you bored yet?" Confusion flickered across Tyler's face, quickly replaced by anger. His grip tightened. "You think you're tough now, Walker?" "No," Ethan replied honestly. "But I think you're small, and I'm not interested anymore." The words fell like stones between them. Ethan felt strangely calm, as if he were observing the scene from a distance. From high above, perhaps, where individual troubles reduced to pattern and perspective. Tyler's fist drew back. Ethan braced himself, but the expected blow never landed. Mr. Richards, the history teacher, rounded the corner. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice carrying the particular authority of a former military man himself. Tyler released Ethan immediately, stepping back with practiced innocence. "Nothing, sir. Just talking." Mr. Richards looked between them, skepticism evident in his expression. "Get to class, Tyler." Now, as Tyler and his friends shuffled away, the teacher turned to Ethan. "You okay, Walker?" Ethan straightened his shirt, oddly steady despite the confrontation. "Yes, sir. Thank you. Might want to be more careful about the company you keep," Mr. Richards advised. "I'm learning that," Ethan replied. Throughout the remainder of the day, Ethan kept expecting the usual aftermath. The renewed targeting, the escalation that typically followed any resistance. But something had shifted. Tyler avoided eye contact in their shared afternoon class, and none of his usual cronies made any moves. After school, instead of taking his usual route home, designed to avoid potential ambush points, Ethan walked directly across the main quad. He felt different. Not confident exactly, but somehow less tethered to the patterns that had defined his school existence for so long. Passing Mr. Holcomb's house, Ethan noticed the old man in his garden, carefully staking tomato plants that had grown heavy with fruit. Without conscious decision, he found himself turning up the walkway. "Need some help?" he called. Mr. Holcomb looked up, a smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Always. Grab those stakes from the porch." They worked together for nearly an hour, securing plants, harvesting ripe vegetables, pulling the occasional weed. The simple, productive labor felt like a continuation of the weekend's work, a different kind of connection forming through shared purpose. "How was school?" Mr. Holcomb asked as they sat on the porch afterward, drinking glasses of cold water. Ethan considered the question. "Different," he finally answered. The old man nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Started reading that book I gave you?" "Not yet," Ethan admitted. "But I will tonight." True to his word, Ethan began reading after dinner. The book, a historical account of bomber crews during World War II, was more engaging than he'd expected. The author had interviewed surviving crew members, capturing their stories in their own words. Ethan found himself looking for mentions of Mr. Holcomb's unit, wondering if his neighbor's experiences might be recorded in these pages. He fell asleep with the book open across his chest, dreams filled with propeller sounds and distant horizons. The rest of the week established a new pattern. Ethan would go to school, keeping a watchful distance from Tyler, but no longer skulking through hallways. Afterward, he would stop by Mr. Holcomb's house, sometimes helping in the garden, sometimes assisting with small household tasks, always ending up in conversation. Mr. Holcomb, having opened the door to his past, seemed willing to share more of his experiences. Not just the war, but his life afterward. College on the GI Bill, meeting Marianne at a dance, his career as an engineer, the children who had moved to distant states and rarely visited anymore. In return, without quite planning to, Ethan began sharing his own life. His troubles at school, his father's abandonment, his mother's struggle to keep their home, his own uncertain future. Mr. Holcomb listened without judgment, occasionally offering perspective but never platitudes. On Friday afternoon, as they cleaned fallen leaves from the garden path, Mr. Holcomb mentioned casually, "Got a project I could use your help with tomorrow, if you're free." "What kind of project?" Ethan asked, curious. "Something in the attic," the old man replied. "Needs a younger back than mine," Ethan agreed without hesitation. These afternoons with Mr. Holcomb had become the most peaceful part of his week, a respite from the tensions of school and the lonely silence of his own house while his mother worked. Saturday morning found Ethan standing in Mr. Holcomb's hallway, watching as the old man pulled down a ceiling hatch, releasing a folding ladder. "Haven't been up there in years," Mr. Holcomb admitted. "Doctor says no ladders for me anymore, but there's something I need to retrieve." Ethan climbed the ladder, emerging into a space that smelled of dust and forgotten summers. The attic was surprisingly organized. Boxes labeled and stacked, old furniture draped with sheets, holiday decorations in clear plastic bins. "What am I looking for?" he called down. "Large trunk," Mr. Holcomb's voice floated up. "She should be toward the back. Has WH painted on the lid?" Ethan made his way carefully across the floorboards, directing his flashlight into the attic's recesses. He found the trunk behind a stack of boxes labeled Christmas, an old-fashioned steamer trunk with peeling leather straps and brass fittings tarnished to a dull brown. "Found it," he called, examining the trunk. The initials WH were indeed painted on the lid in faded white letters. "It's pretty big. Just push it toward the hatch," Mr. Holcomb instructed. "We'll figure out how to get it down." The trunk was heavy but slid relatively easily across the wooden floor. Ethan positioned it near the hatch, then descended the ladder. "What's in it?" he asked, curiosity piqued by the mysterious trunk. "Memories," Mr. Holcomb replied cryptically. "Let's get it downstairs." Together, Ethan doing most of the lifting while Mr. Holcomb steadied and directed, they managed to maneuver the trunk down the ladder and into the hallway. From there, they carried it to the basement, placing it beside the desk they had set up the previous weekend. "Been meaning to go through this for years," Mr. Holcomb said, running a hand across the trunk's dusty lid. "Keep putting it off. Some memories are harder to face than others." He produced a small key from his pocket and inserted it into the trunk's lock. The mechanism turned with reluctance, as if it too were hesitant about revisiting the past. The lid creaked open, releasing the scent of cedar and old paper. Ethan peered inside, seeing neatly folded clothing on top. A uniform, he realized, recognizing the distinctive olive-drab fabric of World War II military issue. Mr. Holcomb lifted the uniform with careful hands, laying it across the desk. Beneath were layers of history, photographs, letters tied with faded ribbon, small boxes containing medals and insignia, notebooks filled with handwriting yellowed by time. "My war," Mr. Holcomb said simply. "Packed it away when I came home. Marianne suggested I keep it, said our children might want to know someday. But they never asked, and after a while, it seemed easier to leave it here." For the next several hours, they explored the trunk's contents. Mr. Holcomb explained each item, the significance of patches and pins, the stories behind photographs, the context for letters written under censorship that spoke volumes in what they couldn't say directly. From the bottom of the trunk, Mr. Holcomb withdrew a leather flight jacket, its sheepskin collar discolored with age but still impressively intact. "My lucky jacket," he explained, running his fingers over the leather. "Wore it on every mission." "Did it work?" Ethan asked. "The luck, I mean." Mr. Holcomb's smile held memories. "I'm here, aren't I?" As afternoon shifted toward evening, they carefully repacked most of the items, Mr. Holcomb occasionally setting aside photographs or documents he wanted to keep out. The uniform and flight jacket, however, remained on the desk. "Thought I might display these," he explained. "Time I stopped hiding the past away." When everything else had been returned to the trunk, Mr. Holcomb reached for the small wooden box Ethan had noticed the previous weekend, the one with intricate carvings that the old man had set aside during their initial packing. "There's one more thing," Mr. Holcomb said, opening the box. Inside lay a pocket watch, its gold case gleaming even in the basement's artificial light. "This was my father's. He gave it to me before my first mission. Sars said it would bring me home." He held the watch out to Ethan. "Take a look." Ethan accepted it carefully, feeling the weight of both metal and meaning in his palm. The watch was beautiful, ornate without being ostentatious, clearly valuable but worn with use rather than kept pristine. He pressed the release and the cover sprang open to reveal a face of ivory-colored enamel, Roman numerals in faded black, hands delicate as insect legs frozen at 347. "It doesn't work anymore," Mr. Holcomb explained. "Stopped during my last mission. Anti-aircraft fire shook the plane so hard the mechanism broke. Found out later we'd been hit at exactly that time, 3:47 in the afternoon. But you made it home," Ethan said, still holding the watch. "By the skin of our teeth." The old man nodded. "Half the instruments gone, 2 engines failing, my co-pilot wounded. Brought her down on nothing but instinct and prayers." He tapped the watch in Ethan's hand. "That's when I got the medal you found. Not for bravery, just for doing what needed doing." Ethan closed the watch, feeling its weight as something more than metal. "It's amazing," he said, handing it back. Mr. Holcomb didn't take it. Instead, he closed Ethan's fingers around the timepiece. "I want you to have it." Ethan blinked, certain he'd misunderstood. "What? I can't. It's too valuable." "Not talking about money," Mr. Holcomb said firmly. "Value's different. My father gave it to me when I needed courage. I'm giving it to you for the same reason." "But I'm not going to war," Ethan protested. The old man's eyes held his. "Aren't you? Might not be the same battlefield, but I recognize the look. Been watching you these past 2 weeks. You're fighting something." Ethan's throat tightened unexpectedly. No one had seen it before. Not his mother, not his teachers, not even Emma with her occasional concerned glances. But this man, this stranger who had become something else entirely, had recognized the daily war Ethan waged simply to exist in his own life. "I can't take this," he insisted, trying to return the watch. "Already decided," Mr. Holcomb replied with the quiet authority that had probably served him well as a commander. Been thinking about it since I saw that bruise on your face that first day. Someone's making your life hell, and you're letting them. The bluntness of the assessment startled Ethan. I'm not letting them, he argued. I just can't. There's 4 of them, and they're bigger, and not talking about fighting back with fists. Mr. Holcomb interrupted. Talking about fighting back by not letting them determine who you are. By remembering you're more than what they see. He tapped the watch again. This got me through because it reminded me people were waiting for me to come home, that I mattered to someone. That's the kind of courage you need, not to beat them, but to outlast them. To remember you're more than this moment. Ethan stared at the watch, feeling its weight change in his hand, becoming something else, something beyond gold and gears. A talisman, perhaps, a connection. Why me? He asked finally. You have kids, grandkids? Who never asked? Mr. Holcomb finished for him. Never showed interest. You did. You listened. And more importantly, you need it now, not later. Ethan's vision blurred unexpectedly. He blinked rapidly, embarrassed by the emotion threatening to spill over. Thank you, he said, his voice rougher than intended. Mr. Holcomb nodded once, acknowledging both the thanks and the emotion behind it. It's getting late, he said, changing the subject with tactful awareness of Ethan's discomfort. Your mother will be wondering where you are. That night, Ethan sat at his desk. The pocket watch opened before him, its hand still pointing to 3:47. He wondered about that moment frozen in time. What Mr. Holcomb had felt, what he had thought when his plane shuddered under enemy fire, when he realized how close death had come. Somehow, the watch made his own troubles seem simultaneously smaller and more manageable. Not because they didn't matter, but because others had faced worse and found ways forward. There was perspective in that knowledge. Not dismissal of his pain, but context for it. The following Monday at school, Ethan carried the watch in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of connections beyond the narrow world of high school hierarchies. When Tyler and his friends approached in the hallway between classes, Ethan found his hand closing around the timepiece, drawing strength from its solid presence. Still here, Walker, Tyler sneered, bumping deliberately into Ethan's shoulder. Thought maybe you'd finally figured out nobody wants you around. The familiar words should have triggered the familiar response. The hunched shoulders, the averted gaze, the attempt to become invisible. Instead, Ethan found himself standing straighter, his eyes meeting Tyler's directly. Actually, Tyler, some people do, he replied, his voice steady. Just not you. And I'm starting to think that's okay. The unexpected response left Tyler momentarily speechless. In that pause, Emma appeared beside Ethan, her presence a surprise but not an unwelcome one. There you are, she said to Ethan, ignoring Tyler completely. We're going to be late for study group. There was no study group, at least none that Ethan knew about, but he recognized the lifeline she was extending. Right, he nodded, stepping around Tyler. Let's go. As they walked away, Ethan expected the usual shove from behind, the escalation that followed any show of defiance. It didn't come. Perhaps it was Emma's presence, perhaps it was the crowded hallway, or perhaps it was the simple fact that bullies, like all predators, preferred targets that behaved predictably. Thanks, he said to Emma once they'd turned the corner. She shrugged, her dark hair falling across one shoulder. No big deal. He's such a jerk. She glanced at him curiously. You seem different, though. Something happened? Ethan considered the question, his hand once again finding the watch in his pocket. Made a friend, he said simply. Good, Emma nodded. About time. The weeks that followed established new patterns. Ethan continued visiting Mr. Holcomb after school, helping with projects around the house and yard. The old man's health was clearly declining, his breathing more labored, his movement slower. But his mind remained sharp, his stories vivid. At school, Ethan gradually found himself less defined by his relationship with Tyler. He joined the aviation club, discovered to his surprise that he had a talent for building detailed model aircraft, and even made a few tentative friendships beyond Emma. Tyler still sneered when they passed in hallways, but the active targeting had mysteriously diminished. You're out a lot these days, his mother commented one evening in late October as Ethan prepared to leave for Mr. Holcomb's house. Should I be meeting this mysterious friend of yours? Ethan laughed. It's Mr. Holcomb, Mom, from next door. I've been helping him with stuff around his house. Her expression registered surprise, then pleasure. The elderly gentleman. That's really nice of you, Ethan. He's interesting, Ethan explained, feeling this was entirely inadequate to describe what Mr. Holcomb had become in his life. He was a bomber pilot in World War II. Has amazing stories. Well, I'm glad you're spending time with him, his mother said. He seemed lonely when I'd see him in his garden. And you seem happier lately. Ethan hadn't thought about it in those terms, but he realized she was right. The constant knot of dread in his stomach had loosened. He walked differently, spoke more freely, smiled more often. The world hadn't fundamentally changed. Tyler still existed, his father was still gone, money was still tight, but his relationship to these facts had shifted somehow. Walking next door that evening, the pocket watch a familiar weight in his jacket, Ethan noticed Mr. Holcomb's lights were off. Unusual for this time of day. He knocked anyway, concern growing when there was no answer. Just as he was about to return home and call for help, the door opened. Mr. Holcomb stood there, looking pale and drawn, supporting himself on a cane Ethan hadn't seen before. Sorry, the old man said, his voice weaker than usual. Took a while to get to the door. Are you okay? Ethan asked, alarmed by Mr. Holcomb's appearance. Had better days, Mr. Holcomb admitted. Heart's giving me trouble. Doctor says it's to be expected. Ethan helped him to his armchair, noticing how the old man's hand trembled as he lowered himself into the seat. Should I call someone? Ethan asked. An ambulance? Mr. Holcomb waved the suggestion away. No need for all that drama. Just need rest. He looked up at Ethan, a shadow of his usual sharpness in his gaze. But I wouldn't mind some company if you've got time. Ethan stayed, making tea the way Mr. Holcomb instructed, listening as the old man spoke not of war this time, but of peace, of the life he'd built with Marianne, of the garden they'd planted together, of the simple pleasures that had defined his life after the violence of his youth. Best days weren't the dramatic ones. Mr. Holcomb mused, his voice strengthening somewhat after the tea. Best days were ordinary. Breakfast with Marianne, watching the kids play in the yard, evenings reading together. You remember the big moments, but you live in the small ones. When Ethan finally left, Mr. Holcomb seemed slightly better, though still far from his usual self. Check in tomorrow? Ethan asked from the doorway. The old man nodded. I'll be here. But the next day, Mr. Holcomb wasn't there. Ethan knocked repeatedly, growing increasingly concerned when there was no answer. Finally, he tried the door and found it unlocked. Something the meticulous Mr. Holcomb would never normally allow. The house was silent, empty. In the kitchen, Ethan found a note on the table, his name written across the folded paper in Mr. Holcomb's precise handwriting. The note was brief. Ethan, had to call an ambulance last night. At Memorial Hospital. Don't worry, just a precaution. Ethan's mother drove him to the hospital after her shift. Concern etched on her face as he explained about Mr. Holcomb's condition and their friendship over the past several weeks. He gave me this, Ethan told her, showing her the pocket watch he now carried everywhere. It was his father's. He took it through the whole war. His mother's expression softened. That's quite a gift, she said. He must think very highly of you. At the hospital, they were directed to the cardiac care unit. Mr. Holcomb occupied a private room, looking smaller and frailer in the hospital bed than Ethan had ever seen him. Medical equipment surrounded him, monitoring vitals, delivering medication through an IV. Despite his obvious weakness, Mr. Holcomb smiled when he saw Ethan. Knew you'd find me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. You left a note, Ethan reminded him, trying to keep his tone light despite the shock of seeing his friend in this state. Always leave a flight plan. Mr. Holcomb nodded. First rule of aviation. His gaze shifted to Ethan's mother, standing just inside the doorway. You must be Mrs. Walker. Your son's been a godsend these past weeks. It's Catherine, please, she replied, stepping forward. And from what Ethan tells me, you've been just as important to him. They stayed for nearly an hour, Ethan recounting school events while Mr. Holcomb listened with the same attentive interest he always showed, despite his obvious fatigue. When a nurse came to check vitals, she gave them a pointed look. Patient needs rest, she said firmly. We'll go, Ethan's mother assured her. But we'll be back tomorrow if that's all right. Mr. Holcomb nodded, looking forward to it. As they prepared to leave, the old man beckoned Ethan closer. Brought the watch? He asked quietly. Ethan nodded, patting his pocket. Always. Good, Mr. Holcomb approved. Remember what it means. Not just old metal, connection. Past to present, one life to another. The next 2 weeks fell into a new routine. School, then hospital visits that grew progressively shorter as Mr. Holcomb's strength ebbed. The doctor spoke in euphemisms that didn't quite disguise the seriousness of his condition. Congestive heart failure, complications, advanced age-limiting treatment options. Ethan brought books to read aloud, knowing Mr. Holcomb's eyesight was failing and suspecting he missed his reading. Sometimes the old man would drift to sleep mid-story, but he always insisted Ethan continue on his next visit from where they'd left off. On a Wednesday afternoon in early November, Ethan arrived to find Mr. Holcomb awake but clearly struggling. His breathing was labored, his color poor, his hands restless against the white hospital sheets. "Bad day," Mr. Holcomb acknowledged before Ethan could pretend not to notice. "Happens. Sit down, read some more of that book." Ethan had been working through a collection of poetry. Yeats, Mr. Holcomb's wife's favorite. He read for nearly 30 minutes. The old man's eyes closed, but his expression attentive, occasionally nodding at particular passages. Between poems, Mr. Holcomb spoke unexpectedly. "Need you to do something for me, Ethan." "Anything," Ethan replied immediately. "In my house, in the kitchen drawer nearest the sink, there's an envelope with your name on it. Keys are under the flower pot by the back door. Get it, read it, follow the instructions." His breathing grew more labored. "Promise me." "I promise," Ethan said, alarmed by the urgency in the old man's tone. "But you're going to be fine. You'll be home soon and—" Mr. Holcomb's laugh was a whisper of its former self. "Always knew when a mission was my last, Ethan. Pilot's intuition." He reached for Ethan's hand, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakness. "Been a privilege, son, sharing stories. Seeing you grow. Remember what I told you about courage?" Tears blurred Ethan's vision. "I'll remember," he promised. A nurse appeared, concerned by changes in the monitoring equipment. "You should go now," she told Ethan gently but firmly. "We need to get the doctor." In the hallway, Ethan pulled out the pocket watch, holding it tightly as if it might somehow transfer strength back to its original owner. For the first time, he wished the hands weren't frozen at 3:47, wished instead that time might stop altogether, or better yet, reverse. He called his mother, who left work early to drive him home. They were halfway there when the hospital called. Catherine answered, her expression telling Ethan everything before she even spoke. "I understand," she said into the phone. "Thank you for letting us know." After hanging up, she pulled the car to the side of the road and turned to Ethan. "I'm so sorry, honey. Mr. Holcomb passed away a few minutes ago." The nurse said it was peaceful, that he wasn't in pain. Ethan stared out the window, tears falling freely now. The autumn landscape blurred into patches of color. The same world that had existed yesterday, that would exist tomorrow, but fundamentally altered by the absence of one person who had seen him, truly seen him, when no one else had bothered to look. "He knew," Ethan said finally. "He gave me a job to do." His mother reached across the center console, squeezing his hand. "Do you want to tell me about it?" Ethan explained about the envelope, the instructions he'd promised to follow. "I need to go to his house," he concluded. "Of course," she nodded, putting the car in drive. "We'll go now." The house felt different without Mr. Holcomb, emptier, quieter, the silence holding a finality that hadn't been there before. They found the key exactly where he'd said it would be, and the envelope in the kitchen drawer, Ethan's name written across the front in familiar handwriting. Inside were two items, a letter and a document that appeared to be legal in nature, with official seals and signatures. The letter was dated 2 weeks earlier. "Ethan, if you're reading this, our conversations have come to their natural conclusion. Don't be sad about that. All stories end, but the good ones leave something behind. You came into my life when I thought I had nothing left to give, and no one left to receive it. You listened when I needed to speak, helped when I needed assistance, and most importantly, you allowed an old man to feel useful again. The enclosed document is a deed transfer. I've left my house and its contents to you and your mother. My lawyer has handled the details. No taxes or complications to worry about. The house needs a family. Your mother needs security. And you, Ethan, need roots and wings in equal measure. Consider this my final mission, ensuring you have both. There's money too, not a fortune, but enough to see you through college if you choose that path. The details are with my lawyer, Mr. Davidson, whose card is attached to the deed. The pocket watch remains yours, of course. When you look at it, remember not the stopping of time, but its continuation through connection. My story is now part of yours, as yours became part of mine. You showed courage these past weeks, not the dramatic kind that makes for exciting stories, but the quieter kind that shapes a life of integrity, the kind that lets you stand straight even when others try to bend you. Keep standing, Ethan. Keep moving forward. With respect and affection, Walter Holcomb, Lieutenant, Redcontronorn, United States Army Air Forces. Ethan read the letter twice, then handed it silently to his mother. She read it, her hand coming to her mouth as she understood its implications. This can't be legal, she whispered, examining the deed with disbelief. We barely knew him. I knew him, Ethan replied simply. And he knew me. The following days passed in a blur of arrangements. Mr. Holcomb's lawyer confirmed that everything was in order. The old man had made the changes to his will immediately after his first hospital admission, ensuring there would be no complications. His own children, comfortably established in their distant lives, had been provided for years earlier and raised no objections to their father's final wishes. The funeral was small but dignified, attended by a few elderly veterans who had known Mr. Holcomb through various organizations, some neighbors, and, to Ethan's surprise, several of his former crew members' children and grandchildren, who had traveled considerable distances to pay their respects to the man who had brought their fathers and grandfathers home from war. At the service, Ethan kept his hand in his pocket, fingers wrapped around the watch that had stopped at 3:47 on a distant afternoon when death had come close but ultimately passed by. Now, decades later, it had finally returned to complete its task. Afterward, visiting hours were held at Mr. Holcomb's, now Ethan and his mother's, house. People gathered in the living room and kitchen, sharing memories and stories. Ethan moved among them, listening more than speaking, collecting fragments of a life he had glimpsed but never fully known. A tall man with military bearing approached him during a quiet moment. "You're Ethan," he said, not a question but a statement. "Walter spoke of you when I called him last month. Said you'd given him purpose in his final days." "He gave me more," Ethan replied honestly. The man nodded, understanding without further explanation. "I'm James Holcomb, Walter's son. Live in Colorado now, don't get back east much." He extended his hand. "Wanted to thank you for being there when we couldn't be." Ethan shook the offered hand, seeing traces of Mr. Holcomb in this stranger's features. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the conventional phrase feeling inadequate but necessary. "Dad lived his life on his own terms." James replied, "Died the same way. Can't ask for more than that." He gestured around the house. "He told me what he was planning with the house. Wanted you to know my sister and I, we think it's right. Dad always said a home needs people who appreciate its history." As the day waned and guests departed, Ethan found himself in the basement, standing before the display Mr. Holcomb had created of his uniform and flight jacket. The pocket watch felt heavy in his hand as he looked at these relics of a younger man who had faced fear and found a way forward. "Ready to go home?" his mother asked, appearing at the bottom of the stairs. Ethan turned, a sad smile touching his lips. "We are home, Mom." She crossed the room, putting an arm around his shoulders. Not having to reach up anymore, he realized suddenly, noting how he had grown these past months without really noticing. "Yes," she agreed softly. "I suppose we are." Later that night, Ethan sat at the desk in what would become his room, not Mr. Holcomb's former study, which he couldn't bring himself to claim, but a smaller room overlooking the garden. He placed the pocket watch on the desktop, the gold gleaming in the lamplight. On impulse, he opened it, expecting to see the familiar frozen hands pointing to 3:47. Instead, he found the watch face blank, the hands missing entirely. For a moment, he thought the watch had somehow broken further. Then he noticed a small folded paper tucked inside the case, visible now where the hands had once been. With careful fingers, he extracted it, unfolding a scrap no larger than a postage stamp. In Mr. Holcomb's precise handwriting, barely legible at this size, were the words, "Time moves only forward. Your hands now, not mine. Set your own course." Ethan closed the watch case, understanding the final gift. Not a frozen moment from someone else's past, but an open possibility. A timepiece waiting for new hands, new hours, new stories. Through the window, he could see the garden where they had worked together. Dormant now for winter, but waiting for spring. Beyond it, lights glowed in neighboring houses, people living their ordinary, extraordinary lives, connecting and separating, remembering and forgetting, all moving through time at the same steady pace. He thought of Mr. Holcomb's words about courage, not the dramatic kind that makes headlines, but the quieter kind that shapes a life of integrity, the kind that lets you stand straight even when others try to bend you. The pocket watch lay silent on his desk, no longer marking time but somehow still keeping it. A golden thread connecting past to present to future, one life to another, one story flowing into the next. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, catching the light from his window before disappearing into darkness. Ethan watched it for a long time, feeling both the weight of what had ended and the lightness of what might begin.